Good afternoon, everyone, and it's great to be back with you. I hope your studying is going well and that you are full into the swing of things with prep for the exams. We're going to be doing a little bit of life science today, and we're going to be doing two parts in particular. We're going to look at theories of evolution, and we're also going to look at speciation. But I hope that you are preparing. I hope that the learning is going well. I hope that you are working every day and that you took into account the tips we gave you the last time for going through the exams. And with that being said, I think let's jump into our first session. We're going to look firstly at the early theories of evolution. There are two kind of less important theorists that they do mention, which is probably not a bad thing just to have a look at. And then we'll spend quite a bit of time going through the differences between Darwin and Lamarck, because those are probably the more important of the two. So the first one that we have, his surname should sound a little bit familiar, okay, is Erasmus Darwin. And Erasmus Darwin was actually the grandfather of the Darwin that we study a little bit later on. But Erasmus Darwin was someone who kind of had his own ideas in terms of evolution and how the thing took place, and what he basically believed and what he kind of hypothesized and what he put forward as an idea is that everything that was alive at this time, at his time, he suggested had evolved from a single filament or a spermatozoan. So he said that everything that we have today on Earth, everything that he could see, he felt had kind of descended from a single filament or spermatozoan. And what he said was he kind of had a little bit of evidence that he used rather, okay, as opposed to evidence that we necessarily agree with. But he had three things that he said kind of added to the validity of his idea and was used in support of his idea. And what he just said is that systems that were classified at that time had shown classifications of the same general pattern and organization. So everything that had kind of been grouped together, he said had been grouped together because they had these similar characteristics, which is sounding slightly familiar, I hope, if you think of the idea of speciation, okay, which is what we'll look at a little bit later on. And then he just said that the appearance of animals can be changed by three things, basically. So he said the first one was selective breeding. Okay, and by doing this, he said we were able to change the appearance of organisms. And selective breeding, if you think of cows, we do this with. If you think of dogs, cats, chickens, just about everything that we can think of, crops as well. So he said that things could change because of selective breeding. But he also said that they could change because of climate. Okay, so climatic differences and things that had possibly happened before. And things that were going to happen could have instigated a change in certain species. So, for example, what he said, normally sheep we know have wool, okay, as a nice covering, as an insulating layer. But what he found was, and what he said rather, is that there were sheep that were maybe from a very harsh climate. It was very hot, it was very warm. So instead of having wool, they actually were covered with long fur. Okay, which would have allowed for them to be a little bit less insulated. Okay, so a climatic factor is something that he took into account. And then the last thing that he said could change the appearance of organisms was that of metamorphosis. Okay, and there, if we think of something like a tadpole changing into a frog, would have been the example that he had used. Now, the thing about Erasmus Darwin is that Charles Darwin and others of the time, okay, actually didn't really subscribe to this. They said that there really wasn't very much evidence to support Erasmus Darwin's theory. So he wrote it down in a book, but it's not generally something today that we consider and that we actually subscribe to. Then another guy that we don't really hear too much about, but maybe just very briefly, is a guy called Alfred Russel Wallace. And the interesting thing about Alfred Russel Wallace is that him and Darwin actually had a very similar idea. And Alfred Wallace was actually the first guy to use the term and to think about the idea of natural selection. And what had basically happened is that he had thought about this, he had written about it already, he had really kind of put things down on paper and thought about it. And by the time Darwin started making a name for himself, friends of Wallace said to him, you better start writing this idea down and handing it in. And what happened was that Alfred Wallace is actually accredited with first using the idea and the term, the catchphrase, I suppose, of natural selection, but he himself had said, you know what, Darwin has done a lot of work, he's actually done a lot of research, he's actually got a lot of support for his theory, and he's really done a lot of, backing work for this idea. So Wallace was kind of happy just to, give the credit, I suppose, to Charles Darwin. But it is just interesting to note that he was actually the first guy, and Darwin was not the only guy that had thought about this idea of natural selection. It was actually something that had been used before. Right, so now I think the two most important theorists that we need to get to are Darwin and Lamarck, okay? And what we'll do is we'll spend a little bit of time just going through each one, and then it's a good idea to make a comparative, maybe a table or just a set of notes, comparing the two, because this is very often how you are asked a question like this. It's normally a comparative question, so they'll give you a scenario, they'll maybe give you an organism, and then they'll say to you, right, here is this animal, explain why, using Darwin and Lamarck's theories, the animal looks the way it does. So if we think of a giraffe with a long neck. So what you have basically is the result, okay, and you have a starting point, the two theorists, but what they're wanting you to do come final exam time is they want you to be able to explain, using a relevant example, the difference between Darwin and Lamarck, and how each of them would have described what was happening. Okay, so Darwin, I think we have just spoken about him very, very briefly when we were here last. But Charles Darwin was someone who was a scientist, but he was also a biologist, and he was also actually a theologist. He was a deeply religious man and actually remained so until the day he died. But I think if you've done a little bit of reading about Darwin, you will also know that he lived in a time where unfortunately there wasn't a lot of space for science and religion at the same time. So basically what had to happen was he was told to choose. The church basically said to him, you cannot do both. You can't believe in God and science, so you're going to have to choose which way you go. And Darwin stuck kind of with the science side. But as I say, that was the career he pursued. He did remain a religious person until he died. And Darwin was someone who did a lot of work on the Galapagos Islands, but not only there. He traveled around quite extensively. And he was on the HMS Beagle. That was the ship that he traveled on. And Darwin was someone who was a keen observer, but Darwin was also someone who realized that there were other people who were also quite keen observers. And what he did was he basically tapped into that idea. Sailors that were on the boat with him, they would take notes, they would have little books, they would write down things, they would sketch new flowers that they saw possibly, and new animals and snails and creatures and things that they came upon when they were sailing and when they docked. And they would all have these little books, and a couple of them, took the thing quite seriously, but it was a hobby. And what eventually happened was when Darwin was able to get his book on the origin of the species going, he had actually collated a lot of information that other sailors had used. Okay, so that is one of the things that really makes him as good as he is, okay, and made him as good as he was, is that he actually drew from other people's experience as well. He asked them for their books, and they were quite willing to, to hand the things over. And in this way, by observing and just really spending time and looking at things and drawing them and observing and taking notes, he was able to piece quite a few things together.